Jenny Lauren Dowden for Conduit News, and today joining us in the studio we have Jay Greene. He is a Senior Research Fellow in the Heritage Foundation Center for Education Policy. Hey, thank you so much for being with us again today.
Thanks for having me back on.
There are so many things that we could cover. We certainly attempted to do that the last time
it was a marathon.
It was so much fun.
Yeah.
And we have had viewers contact us wanting to have you back on, wanting to know more. So thank you so much for coming back in today. Right now here in Arkansas, there is a bill that is being challenged in the courts. It's the SAFE Act, Save Adolescents from Experimental Procedures, which does just that. It protects these kids, these minors, from procedures such that would be classified under gender affirming care. Representative Robin Lundstrom really led the way in bringing this legislation forward, the first in the country, but it is certainly meeting a lot of challenges. Give us your perspective so far with it.
Right. So I think a neutral way to describe what this legislation does is it forbids certain medical interventions for certain purposes for minors. And that's not exceptional. This is something that legislatures do. They forbid certain interventions for minors, and they sometimes forbid it even with parental consent. So, for example, even if parents consent to having their child tattooed, in many states, it's still impermissible for a minor to receive a tattoo. So it's a medical intervention, a needle injecting ink, that's forbidden for minors, even with parental consent. Or there are other things that parents might consent to that are forbidden. So, for example, if I wish my children to drink alcohol at the age of 15, even if I consent as a parent, it still does not enable my child to do that. The legislature can still forbid it. And kind of another example that should be even more obvious is voting. So even if parents say my child's very mature and would make responsible decisions, when you're 15, you still can't vote. So there are lots of things that legislatures decide minors can't do. Even if their parents say that they can.
And I think that's really interesting. When this piece of legislation passed, you probably remember Asa was on with Tucker talking about the SAFE Act, and Governor Hutchinson's argument was, we don't want to tell parents what to do with their children. And that was Tucker's response. Well, but the legislature already does this. We say that kids can't vote. We say that kids can't drink underage. We say that they can't smoke cigarettes or get tattoos, especially with something as permanent as this. Why would this be any different?
Well, look, I think it's a very good natural instinct to defer to parents. I like to defer to parents. That's my preference. And so I think as a general rule, we do want to empower parents to raise their own children in their own ways with their own values. But that doesn't mean we always do it. That should be our default, but sometimes we override that default. And the state of Arkansas's legislature decided that this is one of the instances where they wanted to do it. I think in part because they saw these interventions as experimental for this purpose, that is not proven as effective and safe for the purpose of treating what's called gender dysphoria, and because it's a permanent intervention that has long-lasting effects. And so I think the legislature had concerns about the ability of minors to consent, or their parents to consent on their behalf, to irreversible interventions. And so I think that's what motivated them, and that is what allowed the legislatures, again, I think they share a natural disinclination to intervene in parents raising their children, but this was one of the instances where they felt like that was necessary. I think they also recognized that in many instances, and probably most, even when parents are consenting, they're doing so under duress. They're doing so with coercion, often from medical professionals or from their children themselves, where they're being told that if they don't consent, that their kids will die.
Well, let's talk about
so this is the suicide
threat. So let's talk about that. There was a doctor that testified yesterday that that had that suicide claim. You have done extensive research on this. Walk us through that.
Sure. So the claim is that these medical interventions are necessary to reduce the risk of suicide among young people with gender dysphoria. So just to define some terms, gender dysphoria is where people have an intense feeling that that their body is not consistent with how they think of themselves in their mind. Okay? So the sex of their biological sex of their body does not conform with who they think they really are, and they feel this very strongly, and this is called gender dysphoria. And so interventions have been developed to address gender dysphoria in the direction of changing a child's body so that it conforms with how the child thinks of him or herself in the head, as opposed to altering the body. We could also affirm a child by affirming their biological sex. So we could go the other direction, but these interventions are designed to treat the identity that's in the child's head as the real thing, as opposed to their biology as the real thing. So the interventions are puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and then surgeries. And there's things euphemistically called top surgery, which is double mastectomy for biological girls, and then castration for boys, or surgeries to create an artificial phallus for biological girls. So that's bottom surgery, as it's euphemistically called. So so we have these medical, pharmacological interventions, and then surgical interventions. And the claim is we need to make these interventions widely and readily available because they're protective against suicide, because if there continues to be a dissonance between how the child thinks of him or herself relative to the child's body, that this causes stress and leads to thoughts of suicide. Now, it is the case that children who suffer from gender dysphoria also have a lot of other psychological issues at the same time in many cases. So these are called comorbidities. They have other things going on. So they have high rates of depression and anxiety. And so sometimes they come to think of their body as being out of sync with what's in their mind, as a way of trying to address these underlying depression and anxiety issues, right? So there are a variety of psychological problems going on here. And the question is, do we want to treat these psychological problems with puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, and then eventually with surgery, ultimately leading to sterilization? Right? That is what we're talking about. And the drugs that do exist for puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones have never been rigorously studied for the purpose of treating gender dysphoria. They were approved for treating other disorders, okay? And now they're being used off-label, that is, for reasons and purposes that have never been rigorously studied and proven to be safe and effective. They're being used off-label for these purposes. And if advocates for gender-affirming care, as they like to call it, are convinced that these interventions are necessary for reducing threats of suicide, they should be willing to have randomized experiments to prove it. Right? They should, like the kinds of experiments we need for initial approval of drugs by the FDA, they should do here, where we randomly assign some people to get the drug, some people don't get the drug, and then we compare their outcomes over time and see if the outcomes are different, and then we know if the drug is effective at the purpose of reducing suicide. That has never been done. So what research do we have? We do have only 3 studies, 2 of which have been done by Dr. Jack Turbin, who testified yesterday. And all 3 of those studies, including the 2 by Dr. Turbin, are very bad studies for proving a relationship between these drugs and suicide. What they do is they take samples of adults who identify as transgender, and they ask them, when you were younger, did you seek these drugs did you get these drugs? And have you thought about suicide? Those are the questions,
wow.
okay? Then what they're doing is they're comparing those who sought and got the drugs to those who sought and did not get. So the treatment group is those who sought and got them, and the control group is those who sought and didn't get them. And if they observe a difference in suicide thinking or suicidal ideation between those two groups, they say, see, the drug made a difference.
Wow.
Okay. Now, there are many problems with this approach, but one of the more obvious problems is that there are eligibility criteria for getting these drugs. You're supposed to be psychologically stable to get puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. That's one of the criteria for getting the drugs. If you sought and could not get these drugs when you were younger, one of the reasons could be that you were not psychologically stable. And if you were not psychologically stable, it would be unsurprising if you also reported thinking about suicide, right? So then this research design does not tell us about the causal effects of the drugs. It only tells us about the difference in the population that's able to get the drugs and not, in terms of their initial and later psychological state. And so it provides us with no rigorous evidence. The FDA would dismiss any drug that applied for initial approval with that type of research as the evidence to support it. And in fact, this was something that was asked by the state's attorney in cross-ex of a bioethicist who also was testifying yesterday. And the state's attorney said, would these drugs be approved by the FDA if they were submitted for approval today for the purpose of treating gender dysphoria? And the ethicist had to say that he did not know, that he couldn't say whether they would approve it. And the reason why he can't say whether they would approve it is because they wouldn't.
Right.
And they wouldn't because we don't have the kind of research to support it, which is exactly why the legislature saw these drugs as experimental and unproven in their effectiveness.
Yeah, and then couple that with just the permanency of it all. With
these, right.
You know, it's just a lot. Right. So as we mentioned earlier,
these drugs are not reversible. So there are sometimes there's a claim that you could just stop taking them and then you go back to your prior state. But there's also no evidence of that being true.
Right.
And there's a lot of reason to think it's not true. So sustained use of these drugs will permanently alter one's body. And one of the more important permanent alterations is sterilization.
Yeah. So, why do you think that there is?
We tend not to want to sterilize minors. Right? That's what we're talking about here, is sterilizing minors.
Well, and I think to a lot of people, this is common sense.
Right.
This feels like a very natural thought.
Right.
And it is hard to wrap our brains around. But yet there is such a push now, a coordinated push for this across the entire nation. It's not just here in Arkansas with Representative Lundstrom's legislation. Help us unpack that. Why does it feel, you know, some may say this is just something that has happened very quickly all of a sudden. Is that the case? And why is there such a trend right now?
Right. So it's look, this is a very new phenomenon. And I think it's taken much of the country by surprise. Most people can't even really believe it, right? So they haven't caught up quite with what's happening on the ground. These interventions did not exist at all in the United States for the treatment of gender dysphoria before 2010. Well, 2007 was the very first in Boston, but it didn't kind of spread around to other cities till 2010. And it doesn't really get going till about 2015 when Caitlyn Jenner becomes big news.
Yeah.
And then even then, it doesn't really get going till 2018-19 in terms of much more widespread use. So this is only a few years old.
Yeah.
So most people haven't caught up. When people hear about it, their natural inclination is to think it's probably not a good idea to give permanently body-altering medications to children that sterilize them and leave them not only unable to have children, but also unable to achieve orgasm or normal sexual function. You know, this is something that most people have a natural inclination against.
Yeah.
But the only way you can override that reticence is to pose people with the possibility that there's something worse that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is the kid could kill himself, right? And so that's why the suicide threat is so powerful, is that it's what helps people who are disinclined to get on board,
right?
Because anything's better than a kid killing oneself. And so I think that's why the suicide threat claim is so important, but there's really no rigorous evidence on it at all.
Well, and what's also so interesting is anyone who comes out and speaks out against this, we've now seen letters from administration or, sent to big tech.
Right.
Any major influencers or journalists who are speaking out against this, deplatform them, silence them.
Right. Well, look, I do think it's important that we aren't hateful towards children who are clearly suffering, right? They're having a lot of difficulties. We should be sympathetic to their situation. We should be eager to be helpful to them. But what we don't want to do is put them in charge and affirm whatever they say, even if it's actually harmful to them. Right. So the job of adults is to be supportive and loving while still setting boundaries against self-destructive activities by children. And I think there's good reason to see these interventions as self-destructive.
So this is, as we mentioned, this is in the courts right now. What is your prediction? I've heard many people say, well, it's going to continue to just work its way up through the courts. What do you think?
So look, I'm not a legal expert, and so it's hard for me to guess exactly how this will come out. But I think in some ways, no matter how it comes out in the court, it's a policy victory for the original backers of the legislation. They've already won.
Okay, explain that.
Well, so at a minimum, they've won by putting this issue on the map, so that we're now all beginning to talk about it. And I think the more we talk about it, the more people understand what's going on, the more opposition there will be to it. But they've also won because they've now set the boundaries of what is possible politically. So they were able to muster super majorities to override a veto to pass this legislation. And if it isn't this legislation, they could pass other legislation that targets the same issue in ways that would be less easy to challenge in court. And eventually they're going to figure out the right language and the right tactic to get at this issue without running afoul of legal problems. Right. And sometimes you don't get that on the first try. It's hard. But honestly, if they just keep sticking with trying new legislation and new political tactics to get at it, they're going to win. Because again, I think that there's widespread support in Arkansas for trying to limit the ability of children to inflict permanent harm on themselves and sterilize themselves. I think that is a pretty widely held view in Arkansas. And I think that the more that policymakers keep pushing that issue, they're going to keep winning. Even if they run into some challenges in the court, then they just have to do it again. And just revise the language and do it a new way. So I think they're going to win. I mean, so politically, the people who initially proposed the SAFE Act are going to win. It's just a matter of win with which piece of legislation or which sets of legislation will help them achieve their policy goals. And their policy goals are not to be hateful towards young people who identify as transgender, but actually just to try to protect them from self-destructive activity as minors. And again, all this legislation does is affect decisions by children. If people want to make decisions about altering their body chemistry or physical appearance as adults, then this legislation would not stop them from doing so. It's just something that we don't allow children to do in this legislation.
Great insight. Really appreciate you talking about this today. Anything else that you want to add for people to know about this?
Well, so at Heritage Foundation, I did a study on the suicide threat, where it's not as rigorous as a randomized experiment. It still would not be accepted by the FDA as proof, but it actually finds that the more readily available puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones are, the more elevated the suicide risk is. So actually the danger is in the opposite direction of what Dr. Turbin claimed yesterday in court. And again, I think that's further reason for why it's reasonable for the state legislature to try to restrict access to these drugs by minors.
We will definitely link that article in our post and share with our viewers. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.